screen is very bouncy today. I apologize if the image looks wavy. All right. So this is one of the classes that I like to have every single semester because just about every time I grade a stack of essays, this is an issue that comes up pretty frequently of students kind of just plopping the quote into the middle of a paragraph and then walking away from it. And there's a lot of issues with this. First of all, you are always supposed to connect your quotes with a sentence frame. It has to be tied to the rest of the paragraph. Very rarely can you let a quote stand alone by itself. There has to be some sort of introduction. And in all cases, a quote has to be explained and shown how it supports your main claim of your paragraph, which begs the question if you have a topic sentence or not. So some of my more common comments on essays are missing topic sentences, missing completely. There's not one. They just get started into the summary of whatever it is they're talking about. And failure to integrate quotes. Those are two of my more common comments on essays. So every essay should have a thesis statement, a main claim that the whole essay is going to support, right? Well, every paragraph is supposed to have a topic sentence that supports that thesis. Topic sentence is going to be a piece of that thesis and is going to provide a specific example that supports that thesis statement. In order to support that topic sentence, you need evidence. Okay, you have a quote. That's the strongest evidence. Okay, that quote often just gets dropped into the middle of a paragraph and then left alone. And that can't happen. We have to make sure that your evidence is used properly, not just handed to you. Okay? Your evidence needs to properly support your claim, your topic sentence. You are not going to want to choose evidence that supports the summary. You want to give evidence that supports your claim. All right, that's a very, very big distinction that students miss. A lot of times I see students choose a quote that supports the summary of this event instead of actually showing what's important about that event. It's kind of hard to explain first. I mean, you could introduce the quote and then explain it is more typical. I think I've told y'all before that I teach 6th grade in middle school face to face. And there's a lot of things that I do simply because I have also taught high school. And I teach them things in a very specific way in order to get them in or out of habits before they get to high school. And one of the habits that I get them into very early is using evidence, is citing evidence. And that's required. It's one of the big things for 6th grade. In order to teach them how to write a proper response paragraph, we teach them the RACES method, RACES, RACES. You may have heard of this before, but basically it's restating and answering the question, including a citation, explaining it, and then summing it up. Seems like a very simple method, but it's actually solid. Like if you were to use something like that is as each of your body paragraphs, obviously you're writing a high school level essay and you may make it more complicated than that, but those are the most important parts. The restated answer is going to be your topic sentence. You always need to have a citation, a quote. You have to have at least one quote per body paragraph. The E means that you have explained that quote and shown how it supports the answer, and the S sums it all up and ties it together. Okay, if you're having trouble using these quotes correctly, following a basic method like that might help you get into a habit. I always teach my kids to use sentence frames. Always, always, always. You cannot just put a quote and leave it. You have to either use a sentence frame or an introduction. Something simple, something even as simple as the text states or according to the text. A lot of students introduce the page number or the chapter number and act number in Act 2, Reverend Hale said, blah, 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 blah. And in the next sentence, saying something to the effect of, this shows that. And then explain what it is that he said and what it tells you about his state of mind, how he changed his mind, those things. I'm referring specifically to the Crucible essay because at this point, most of you have written that essay. So for that Crucible essay, let's take the example of the thesis statement being something about Reverend Hale and how he changes his mind and how he very directly affects the actions of the play as well as directly affects the deaths of several characters. You would have several paragraphs with topic sentences that support that thesis. The first one might talk about what his mindset was when he first came to town and how he talks about, and you would use a quote there where he mentions, how many death warrants he's already written. He signed XYZ number of death certificates or warrants for their death or something like that. And you would say in Act 1, when he first arrives to town, Reverend Hale says, blah, blah, blah. This shows that he is expecting to find witchcraft and put people to death. Something like that. A very simple, even something like a very simple method like that is fine until you get used to being more purposeful, being very purposeful with the usage of those quotes. What is the best thing to support this, this, this? I would not honestly use the word quote in a paragraph. Like you're saying, can we say the next quote supports? No, I would not say that. I honestly wouldn't say the word quote at all. I would give context for that quote as your introduction to that quote. For example, we're talking about the Gatsby essay. You could say something like, while watching Gatsby reach his hands out across the water, what's his name? Now I can't think of the main character's name. Nick Carraway. I don't know why I can't think of his name. Nick says, blah, 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 or he did this or the other thing. This shows that. You really need to get formulaic like that. That's fine. Or you could say something to the effect of Gatsby is obsessed with this green light because it shows Daisy, whatever. Consider introductions to quotes more about providing context to that quote. Because when you take a quote, you are taking it out of its paragraph, you're taking it out of its chapter, you're taking it out of the book, and you're presenting a single sentence, usually a single sentence, not half a page. I have found so many quotes that are more than half the page. You are taking it out of its context, and it might mean almost nothing without some context. So sometimes if you're struggling to think about how to introduce a quote, provide context for that quote. Maybe just a couple of words or even half a sentence that explains where that quote might come up in this text. That might be a good introduction. If it seems, for example, let's go back to the Hale idea. If you want to use the quote, I have signed X number of death warrants, blah, 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 you could say something to the effect of, when Reverend Hale first comes to Salem, he proudly states, and then provide the quote. And then you could say something to the effect of, his words show his mindset of pride, and that he fully believes that he's going to find witchcraft and probably will sentence certain people to death. So providing the introduction, providing who's talking. Okay, I cannot tell you how many quotes I have found that don't even tell me who's talking. Honestly, sometimes enough introduction for a quote is simply Gatsby said. It's not, I mean, it's not amazing. It's not awesome. It's not excellent, but it's sufficient if that's really as much as you can manage. But you always have to follow those quotes up. You always have to explain them. You're not going into depth and explaining word for word and summarizing what's happening in the quote. That's not what I mean by explaining. But what I mean by explaining is explain how the evidence supports your answer. What does that quote show the reader that proves your point? I would even get used to using the word show or proves. Proves might be a little difficult, but if that's what it takes, that might be helpful. What I'm going to do now, um, I put this link in the note board down in the bottom right. What I'm going to do now is pull up, um, this is a source that I provide a lot of times when students are struggling with integrating quotes, especially if they're having trouble with introducing quotes. I provide this source because it gives a lot of great examples. I'm going to turn my webcam off, switch to share my screen, and open this source. I do have it down there in the note board, and hopefully you're able to click on that. I'm going to turn my cam off. Let's go to screen share. It's loading. There we go. All right. All right, so this is a source that I like to, like I said, I like to provide to integrate a quote. Let's start at the beginning. You should never have a quotation standing alone as a complete sentence, or worse, as an incomplete sentence. I can't tell you how many times I find that in your writing. The quotation will seem disconnected from your own thoughts and from the flow of your sentences. Ways to integrate quotes properly into your own sentences with correct use of punctuation are explained below. One of the ways is to introduce the quotation with a complete sentence and a colon. For example, in Where I Lived and What I Lived For, Thoreau states directly his purpose for going into the woods, colon. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when it came to die, discover that I had not lived. That quote is tied directly with a colon. The very next sentence after that quote is to explain that quote. Not a summary of the quote, an explanation of how it supports the topic sentence of that paragraph. Thoreau ends his essay with a metaphor, colon, time is but the stream I go a-fishing in. Showing that blah, blah, blah. Number two, using an introductory or explanatory phrase, but not a complete sentence, separated from the quotation with a comma. According to Thoreau, comma, we do not ride on the railroad, it rides upon us. You might want to explain that one a little bit because that's a little difficult. That's a little bit of an odd statement. You should use a comma to separate your own words from the quotation when your introductory or explanatory phrase ends with a verb, such as says, said, thinks, believes, ponders, recalls, questions, and asks. Those are all such awesome words. Those are such awesome words to introduce a quotation. Using the word according or suggests. Those are all awesome. A lot of students excessively use the word states. Yeah, it's okay. but it's not very creative. There's a list here of all these different words that you could possibly use to help introduce a quote, especially if it's a spoken quote and not like a narrator quote. Number 3, make the quotation a part of your own sentence without any punctuation between your own words and the words you are quoting. This is good, but should be used sparingly. And even if you were to do this, you still have to explain it. An example 2, Thoreau suggests the consequences of making ourselves slaves to progress when he says that we do not ride on the railroad, it rides upon us. The consequences he mentioned are that blah, blah, blah. What this means, what it's doing is the time that an introduction like this would come into play is if the context requires a little bit of summarizing, meaning if let's say you're pulling a small piece of a quote out of a large paragraph, but that whole paragraph is important, but the quote is the most important. You could use this method of introduction in that situation where you basically summarize the rest of the paragraph and then roll into that quote. So maybe the words too often here were said in a different way in a different line. But by summarizing it and then rolling into the quote here, this has simplified that paragraph down and focused on the most important part of the paragraph, the most supportive part of the quote. Number 4, use short quotations, only a few words, as part of your sentence. For example, this one here, the piece drinks at and detect how shallow it is probably part of a much larger piece of poetry that is being trimmed down to avoid a large block quote to the most important parts. Although Thoreau drinks at the stream of time, he can detect how shallow it is. Like I said, this is probably several lines apart in a particular stanza or paragraph. But by doing it this way, we pull the more important parts together to make a particular point. Okay. I've also heard of a method called the Oreo method, and I'm not going to go through the whole presentation, but the Oreo method is basically making sure that you have introduction, quote, explanation, Oreo, so that the quote is the icing of the cookie and the introduction and the explanation are the cookies themselves. Sandwich that quote. Sandwich that quote inside your words. I'll take screen share off because it takes a lot of broadband. Okay, so that is another way of looking at it, is to sandwich your quote in between your words. Because remember, the quote is supporting you. The quote is supporting you and your claim that you're presenting as fact, and you're using the quote to support you. There are times where I see students that are very weak in their writing that use the quote in the other direction. They basically support the quote, and they let the quote do the heavy lifting for them. When in reality, the quote is supposed to support, not carry the paragraph. So your claim needs to be strong, your introduction and your follow-up. You have to make sure that you tie it up. So basically, you're going to assume that your reader doesn't understand that quote and doesn't understand why you would use it. Like, that's a random quote. Why would you use that? You got to tell them. You got to explain it to them. Check on my comments here. Yeah, that's fine to use different pieces of a quote and put it together as one quote. You do have to punctuate it very carefully. I did not go over the punctuation in depth, but that link that I provided does provide very careful punctuation on how to do that. One of the easiest ways to do that, and you chop out like a middle of a sentence, is to do a dot, dot, dot in between, or to do as that sentence did and present a couple of words from the quote, insert some of your words, and then come back and put more words back in. That's fine. And in reality, that is better because it is not necessarily a good idea. The more quote is not better. More quote is not always better. I have seen students try to include these huge block quotes to make their paper longer when they really didn't have much of a writer's voice, when they really did sit in almost nothing themselves. And they let the quote do the dirty work for them. They didn't even really explain it. So a well-chosen quote is better than a long quote. A well-chosen quote that shows mindset of characters, um, proof. Like I said, the quote that I would use for Reverend Hale is that one where he talks about how many death warrants he signed. And that's just like one sentence. Um, it doesn't need to be long, you know? It's that's enough to show his determination, his pride, and his beliefs when he arrives. So the point is here that I'll use the expression free floating quote, freestanding quote, or floating quote. Those are some of the expressions that I use when I'm talking about this, or I tell you that your quote is not integrated. So if you present a paragraph and you put the quote in, and the very beginning of the sentence is quotation marks, you've not integrated your quote. Okay. The very beginning of the sentence that your quote is used in has to be your words. It cannot be quotation marks and then the beginning of the quote. It has to be your words, um, because you have to connect it to your writing. You have to provide some context. You have to provide some introduction. And then you're going to follow up with an explanation as to what that quote does to support your theory, your claim. Does it show what the character is thinking? Does it show the character's motivation? Does it exemplify a particular message or theme or idea that the author is trying to get across? Like I said, you should never use your quote to support what happens in a paragraph. Um, this is something a lot of students have a hard time with. They will write until they're blue in the face about what happened in a story, what happens in regards to a theme, but they don't explain why or how. Those are the more important words. Explaining what happened in a text is a book report, not an analytical essay. An analytical essay requires you to analyze, to show why and how of that text. How does an author show that a particular character is greedy? Why is this character greedy? Um, in reference to Reverend Hale, how does the author show that he changes his mind and promotes and supports the plot? Not just what he does, but how does he move that plot forward? Um, that's something that analyzing is, it's the meat and potatoes of an analytical essay. It's what's important. That's why I'm saying that when you choose your quote, you need to make sure it's not just a that something happened, but why or how something happened. It's a quote that you can use to support and to support an analyzation, to support a underlying claim or an underlying message or an underlying theme. What does it show? Not don't tell that something happened. Show what's important about it. Looking here, I'm catching up on messages. I've got double screens going here. That doesn't help. If the quote also has a quote from another piece, how do we use the punctuation? You mean like commas and okay, typically, if I remember correctly, if you have a quote within a quote, the inner quote uses single quotation marks and the outer quote uses double. I think, if I remember correctly, that's how it's done. It's not something that comes up very often in this course. Very rarely does that occur. I can't even think of a time that that's happened in this course. But I think that's what you do. You put single quotations and then double. No, because it's now part of the larger quote. Okay, yeah, I can spend a little time on that. I did do a class about that 3 weeks ago, maybe, can't remember. But to analyze is to explain why or how something happened. So let's take the example. Let's go back to the crucible. Um, again, the one that comes to mind most frequently is the Reverend Hale topic. No, I'm going to switch that up. I'm going to go back to Mary, the topic about Mary. So the topic about Mary was how she moves the story forward, what she does to affect the outcome of the story. Now, if you were writing a book report, you would simply say what she did. She lied in court. She was manipulated by Abigail. She gave a puppet, all of these things. You can tell me what she did until the cows come home. And you can use your quote, so maybe you chose a quote about what Mary actually said when she gave her the puppet. It's not going to tell me anything. That doesn't tell me anything about the motivation or the whys. How does Mary move the plot forward? Okay. Well, she moves the plot forward because she is being manipulated by Abigail. And what she says and what she does directly affects the lives of those around her. She is easily manipulated, and this can be shown by when Abigail says this, and then Mary does this. That would be an example of that that's being analyzed. I'm going to also go back to an example of Romeo and Juliet. So this is the example that I used in the analytical essay class that I gave a couple weeks back. If I'm trying to show that Juliet's parents participated in her death by forcing her to make choices against her will, I need to show examples of them doing that. And then I need to say why. I need to tell you why that choice contributed to her death. So I could mention that they were trying to force her to marry a particular character. And I would include a quote that shows that, maybe their explanation. And then I would say something about how this shows that she is being forced into something that she doesn't want to do, which caused her undue stress or something of that regard. So I think it's important when you're writing an analytical essay to go back and make sure that you're looking at the whys and the hows and not just the that's and the what's. It is really important to plan things out. You have to have that thesis statement written correctly, and all of the supporting paragraphs have to have a topic sentence and support that thesis. You can even provide your 3 examples in your thesis statement. Reverend Hale moves the plot of the Crucible forward by doing this, this, and this. Okay, now I'm going to look at each of those examples in my paragraphs. First this one, and now this one, and now this one. The second essay after the Crucible is Huckleberry Finn. Do I have that right? In the AB course? Okay. For the Huckleberry Finn, there are several different topics to choose from. I'm going to tell you now, Mark Twain is not a racist. I have had several essays, at least once a year, a school year, not per semester, but at least once a year, I have someone trying to claim that Mark Twain is a racist and that he used, let's just say the N word, because he didn't know better. I've actually had students claim that. Don't say that, it's not true. He is absolutely the opposite of a racist. So with that essay, there are a couple different ones. One of them one of the topics talks about Huckleberry and his development and his growth. Let's take the example of his development and his growth. How does he change over the course of the book? It could be easy just to provide examples. But you also kind of need to tell me why those things happen. So for example, at the beginning of the book, Huckleberry is a racist. He believes and agrees with the law that stated at the time that if a slave were to escape from his owner, I don't like using those words, but that's just what it is. If a slave were to escape from his owner, then he has to be returned to his owner. And he was totally cool with that law because he was raised that way. So I could make one of my paragraphs about how at the beginning of the story, he would have made the choice to turn Jim in because he was an escaped slave. He was somebody's property. However, I would have to show a quote, and then I would also include a quote about how he struggles with his change. His change doesn't come easy for him. He doesn't change overnight. He has issues of conscience because this is the way he's been raised and it's still the law. So shouldn't I turn him in? But he's learning to realize that this is a human being and he doesn't want to turn him in. Excuse me. So you would have to show that background, that he's struggling with his conscience and things like that. The reason I bring up that Mark Twain I've often is not a racist is because I've had essays being written that claim he is. And that means that the novel was not analyzed well. It was not understood well. Quite the contrary, just because Twain included racist characters and foul words shows that he's not. Because the characters that he includes that are racist are ridiculous. They are shown to be They're not the good guys. They're not the good characters. He shows, for example, Huck's father, Pap, was definitely racist. He raised Huck as a racist, and Huck grew out of it. Pap is not the good guy. He's abusive. He's a drunk. He's a racist. So the characters that are racist are not supported, are not considered the good guys. They're the ones that have issues with Huck and that Huck has issues with. So a proper analyzation of that, Huck would be an excellent, Pap would be an excellent example to show how Twain is not racist, because not only is this man racist, he is also a child abuser and he is a drunkard. Therefore, he can't be a good guy. So that means that Twain is trying to show how ridiculous racism is because it's coming together in this one person with these other awful things. That would be an example of analyzing, of taking this particular character and looking at him as a whole and saying, okay, well, he's not a good guy because of these other things. Therefore, this is also being taken kit and caboodle as being a bad thing. So that essay, there are definitely ways to go wrong with that one. But what's important is that your quotes exemplify your point and that you explain how it exemplifies your point. I've provided a lot of examples, and I hope that I haven't rambled myself into a corner. Like something actually made sense, especially since I wasn't prepared to discuss that particular topic. If anybody has specific questions on either quotes or essays, I'm happy to shoot out as many answers as I can come up with. I'm trying not to give away entire essays. I mean, I could sit here and write you an entire essay because I've been grading them for so long that I knew that I can tell you a good one from a bad one. But make sure that you are focusing more on the shows and the hows and the whys, and not the that happened and this happened. Your events are not what you're writing about. You are writing about the shows and the hows and the whys. That's what's important about an analytical essay. You're analyzing what's behind it. For example, when students write about theme, sometimes they have a theme of, let's say for The Great Gatsby, that a theme of materialism. Okay, that's not much of a theme. That happened and this happened essay will simply list the characters that are materialistic and show how they're materialistic. A truly analytical essay is going to look at those characters and show why this isn't working for them. Or that maybe they're shallow. Or it's not necessarily considered a good thing. For example, you can say that Tom and Daisy are materialistic, but they also don't care about other people. And your quote would be something in regards to how they are careless and reckless. There's a quote in there that says something about careless and reckless, which shows that the amount of money they have has taught them it doesn't matter what they break, they can just buy another one. And that's not good. They steamroll over people. Does anyone have any specific questions about either using integrating quotes or analyzing essays? Okay. Either of you, both of you. You're going to have to be more specific because different kids are on different schedules. What do you mean by which test are you referring to, and what do you mean by they were different? Okay. Can you be more specific about your question? Yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, that the puppet or the poppet or the voodoo doll or whatever you want to call it was a huge piece of the story because if I remember correctly, it threw someone else completely under the bus. And yeah, why did she make it? What was her intention behind it, and how can you prove that that was her intention? Um, yeah, I would say that'd be correct. Okay. I'm sorry, I don't understand the question or why that's. You're not going to be given all of the questions in the unit ahead of time. I mean, none of the tests give you all the questions in the unit. The review questions are supposed to get you going in a specific direction. You're not going to have, it's not like a study guide where you're given the test ahead of time. All of the tests are like that. It might give you some of them. Yeah, no, we don't do like give you the test ahead of time, study these questions. Yes. But remember, you have to prove it. You have to prove it. You can't just tell your reader why it's important. You have to provide evidence why it's important. Um, Examples, not a summary. Examples, quotes, just explanations of those quotes. Those are all more important. Yeah. You are explaining why and why it's important. Absolutely. The whys and the hows and the what's significant. Significant is a good word. You can even use it in your essay if you want to. The significance of this is that it shows Mary had this intention. Something like that. Um, it depends on the situation. Did you turn in the final draft, or was it one of those situations where you had to turn it in because I hadn't created the rough draft yet? I apologize, I don't remember. It was a while back. I don't understand the question. Do not use shows with quotes. I'm not even sure. I don't know what your question is. Oh, got it. No, I would not introduce a quote like that. Like I said, it needs to provide some context. It needs to, talk about who's talking. Um, I wouldn't even use the word quote, honestly. Yeah, that's fine. If not in that kind of situation, that's why I made the comment that I did, that you can still go back and redo it, because sometimes the timeline moves faster than I can. Yeah, it does. And I teach full time, sixth grade. Sixth grade. Ooh, we had another fight today. Goodness, it was hot and hormones. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, have a great week. I'll probably do office hours next week, hopefully. Yeah, absolutely.